Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name's Kate Halliday from SMMGP, and I'll be the chair for the webinar tonight. I'm really pleased to have another webinar that is focusing on criminal justice settings. This is a follow-on webinar from something that we held in December of last year. We held a webinar on methadone and buprenorphine prescribing in secure environments. And the feedback we had from that was that people wanted to know a bit more about buprenorphine in criminal justice settings. And I guess that's understandable because there are quite a few issues around buprenorphine prescribing in criminal justice settings, secure environments in particular, but also in the community. And we're hoping that some of that will make itself apparent tonight. This webinar has been made possible by Ethifarm, who've given us an educational grant. So thank you very much to Ethifarm. I'd like to make it clear they're very good to work with because they are really long arm and they let us decide the content of the webinars. And so this webinar has been very much directed by the clinicians who will be presenting together with SMMGP. So the format of the webinar tonight will be that we are going to have 3 presentations, each of around 10 to 15 minutes, given by experts in the field, giving their view on what the real picture is of buprenorphine prescribing in criminal justice settings. Now, you'll all have a little chat box that you will see in your screens. And if you want to write in a question or make a comment, I can put those to our presenters at the end of their presentations, and there should be some time for some questions. I would like to say that we do have a lot of people watching tonight, so apologies in advance if I do not manage to get round to all the questions. But one of our presenters, Jake Hard, has very kindly said that if people want to ask questions and we didn't get round to them, he's quite happy for you to email him, so we'll provide details of how to contact him in a follow-up email after this webinar. So, just to remind you as well that this webinar is being recorded, so if there's something that you would like to watch again, you'll get the chance to do so, and we'll give you a link on how to do that in the next few days. And I would also just like to remind you that SMMGP does have a premium membership scheme, and that's a paid-for scheme, which is very reasonable, and it gives you a minimum of 15 hours CPD per year for people working in drug and alcohol sector. It's a combination of webinars and précis of research and clinical comment. So if you're not already a member, do check that out. Okay, before we go on to our first presentation, we would like to ask you a couple of questions. And so you should see on your screens now some questions, and we would like to know which setting that you work in. And I can see that you are beginning to give us some answers. You're still answering. I'll give it a few more seconds. We're still getting some answers in. Okay. I'm going to share the answers with you now. So you can see that 33% of you are working in prison or young offenders institutions, 8% in another secure environment, 9% of you work in community criminal justice settings, 31% in other community settings, and we've got 19% in other. Okay, great, thanks very much. And just one more question for you. What's your role? And we're still getting a few answers in. Okay, I think we're just about there, so I'll show you what you have replied. And I think that seems to have disappeared a little bit. I can tell you, here we go, that 29% of you are doctors, 31% of you are nurses, we have 10% of you as pharmacists, we've got 6% as key workers and 24% as others. Okay, well, I think it's time now to get on to the meat of the evening. I'm really pleased to introduce our first presenter. Our first presenter is Jake Hard, and he is a GP. He also works in two different prisons, Her Majesty's Prison, Eastwood Park, and also at Leyhill. And he is also the chair of the Secure Environments Group, which is the RCGP group that looks at secure environments. And so with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jake.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody that's on the line, and thank you for contributing your responses to the poll. It was really interesting information on there, and it really helps me and I guess all of us understand what topics we're covering and how we can make it more specific to yourselves. So the purpose of my part of this is just to introduce the reason for this particular webinar and some of the elements that have caused me to question this over the years of experience I've had of working in the prison setting. So we've titled this, or I've titled this, The Real Picture of Buprenorphine in the Criminal Justice Setting. And as I say, I'm going to try and cover a few things fairly swiftly, look at the guidance, touch on the principle of equivalence, have a look at some of the formulations of buprenorphine, and if I'm lucky, then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So I don't want to overdo the guidance side of it, but the two things that I'll be referring to mostly are the NICE technology appraisal guidance from 2007 for methadone and buprenorphine for the management of opioid dependence, and of course the Orange Book, which was re-edited and published last year. So turning to the technology appraisal, I think the useful things to say about this are summarised on the quotes that I've brought out on the subsequent slides. Ultimately, it says that methadone and buprenorphine are both effective at achieving positive outcomes for heroin-dependent individuals. They're both effective for maintenance, and they're both cost-effective and recommended for the treatment and prevention of withdrawal, as Kate touched on. We talked about these in the previous webinar on opiate substitution therapy. So at the moment, there's nothing to suggest that there should be any practical difference between the two treatments. They summarise in this guidance that the committee determined that there was actually no specific reason to qualify as one being more relevant than the other, and therefore sort of rested their advice on the notion that it should be clinically directed by the prescriber, taking into account the person's history. The only thing it touched on slightly with regards to buprenorphine, which I found interesting from 2007 onwards, which hasn't really been borne out, is it does say there that for people who are less opioid dependent and are planning to become abstinent, buprenorphine may provide greater flexibility and enable earlier detoxification. I'm certainly not aware that that was the case when I was working in the community, and it's certainly not something I became aware of in the prison setting. So the intention was that that guidance should allow you as clinicians to weigh up the risks and benefits of prescribing either methadone or buprenorphine, and to take into account you know, the lifestyle factors and personal choice of the patient that you're treating. And we touched on that before in the previous webinar, where we looked at some of the factors around why we might choose one or the other. It's important to note this guidance was reviewed in February 2016, and at that time they concluded that there was no additional evidence to change that guidance from 2007. But I'll come back to that because I do wonder whether that might need to be revisited. So turning to the Orange Book, it goes into a little bit more detail. It states, there's insufficient evidence for justifying one drug over another. It's important that we maintain our independence from exaggerating the benefits of one drug over another, and thereby allowing patient choice. And that it's a reminder that we must discuss the complexities of the treatment that we're providing, so that they can accept that treatment, with consent. So we've touched on some of these before, but I'll go through them again. We need to take into account patient choice, patient's pre-existing preference or experience for one treatment over another. Sometimes we may need to look at the clinical elements of rapid induction versus detox. There may be specific safety concerns around prescribing one or the other of methadone or buprenorphine. And there may be additional local factors such as availability. I think it's fair to say that those are quite broad headlines in terms of the factors to consider, and we can drill down into those in more detail. And certainly, the way that they're described, they don't necessarily articulate some of the pressures and the factors relative to the prison environment. So, moving on to what we see in practice, I think it's fair to say that the proportion of prescribing in the prison does not match what we see in the community. And the little bit of research I've been able to do around this suggests that about 80% of people in the community on methadone and about 20% of people on buprenorphine for OST. Although I have to say, where I worked in South Wales, it didn't reach as high as 20%. It was probably a little bit lower than that. And if we relate this information back to the prison environment, we look that actually, for obvious reasons, some of which we've touched on before, and I can certainly go into more detail for those who may not be aware, but the prison environment and buprenorphine has always had a difficult relationship because of the issues around diversion, bullying and violence. So in respect of that, prisons and healthcare providers have been somewhat limited in being able to provide buprenorphine up to that 20% level that we see in the community. And in fact, some prisons are not providing buprenorphine at all, as I understand it. So, touching on a subject that's dear to my heart is the principle of equivalence. And part of the definition that we provided from the college last July, I can make the reference available for you, indicates that treatment should be at least equivalent in range and quality, and with that available to the wider community. And I think the key words there are at least, and that key component is there to speak to the fact that it cannot be the same. Prisons are not the same as being in the community and vice versa. So we use the term at least to indicate where something needs to be different. I shy away from using the word better, but it needs to be at least consistent in range and quality. So turning to the medications that we have and just looking at the formulations to try and understand why things may not be equivalent, then we can hopefully look through those in more detail. But I think it's fair to say that methadone has been around and first line in prisons for an extraordinarily long time and has not changed in its formulation. We don't use fiseptone tablets, and I'm only aware of very rare use of fiseptone tablets in the community, but it's liquid formulation because of the issues of diversion and injecting when fiseptone first came out. And I think we need a change in respect of the fact that we have only two preparations. So methadone, as I say, liquid formulation, 1 milligram per mil. We had buprenorphine come on the scene, initially available as Subutex, which was branded in 2 and 8 milligram tablets, available in in this number of strengths as sublingual tablets. At that time, with some difficulty with people getting off the 2 milligram tablets, occasionally we used Temgesics, 200 and 400 micrograms. Of course, that was unlicensed. And then subsequent to that, we had the arrival of Suboxone on the scene, which contained buprenorphine and naloxone in a 4-to-1 ratio with the aim that it would hopefully reduce people from snorting and injecting it, because obviously the naloxone would precipitate withdrawal. So now over to the new horizon. For me, this is really exciting because, as I say, in the 13 years that I've worked in prisons, I've been stuck with effectively 2 treatments. It's either buprenorphine or methadone. And because of the issues that I relayed earlier about buprenorphine and the diversion, very much curtailed in being able to maximize the use of that medication. So we now have a new preparation on the scene, which I'm sure you're aware of, the oral liofilisates, available as Espranor, which is 2 milligrams and 8 milligrams. This is a novel way of delivering the medication directly, and therefore enabling the person to take their medication with a much reduced risk of diversion. I'm aware, and obviously the webinar will touch on the fact that this medication is currently being used. There is other new preparations on the horizon, and the one that's currently licensed in the UK is Buvidal, and that's available as a weekly or a monthly injection. But there are actually some other products around the world, and I thought I'd just mention these just out of interest. They're not available in the UK yet, but we have Probufine, which I think is used in the States, and that's a 6-monthly subdermal implant, which is for people who are on a stable dose of 8 milligrams of buprenorphine or less. And then you've got Sublocade, which is for also a 1-monthly subcutaneous injection. So it's interesting to see that these are new formulations. To me, it opens the door to having new opportunities to treat people and see the benefits of using this medication with some of my patients. So while, just sort of finishing up here, but while patients' preferences are important, we need to take into account those factors that are relevant to the prison setting, that can be a risk. These new preparations do potentially give us opportunities to change practice and to make things safer for our patients. And I'm looking forward to those changes, and I think my own feelings, I'd like to embrace those. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. And before we move on to our next presenter, I'm just going to ask you, the audience, a couple of more questions. So we are interested to know, this is for people working in a prison setting, what the percentage of the split between methadone and buprenorphine is for those in treatment. We're getting, the votes are coming in. We've got a few more to go, so I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. We're getting a bit closer. Just going to leave it open for a few more seconds because the voting is still going on. Okay. And I can share with you that it looks like half of you aren't working, just over half of you aren't working in a prison setting. But for those of you who are, the vast majority are, well, let's see, 0 to 100, 0 methadone to 100, sorry, I'm going to start that again. 0 buprenorphine to 100% methadone for almost 10% of you, 9% of you. And then it looks like the most common split is 10% buprenorphine to 90% methadone, which I suspect isn't going to surprise too many people. And I do have one more question for you. I'm having problems getting the second question up. Nope, I've got it now. Here we go. We want to ask the same question, basically, but if you work in the community. So if you're working in the community, what is that split between buprenorphine and methadone? And the votes are coming in. I'm going to leave it open for a little bit longer. And votes are still coming in. Okay, we're beginning to slow down now, so I'm going to close the voting and I'll share the results. Okay, so I think that probably isn't going to be a huge surprise to people, that there are far more people saying that there is more buprenorphine prescribing going on in community settings than there is in prison settings, with only 1% saying that it's 0 buprenorphine to 100% methadone. So I'd like to now move on to our next speaker, and I'm really pleased to introduce Bernadette Hard. Bernadette is a GP specialist in addictions who works with Kaleidoscope, and she's going to present on some really interesting data that she has collected as part of her work working both in community and in prison settings. So over to you, Bernadette.
Hello. So now I feel like I'm on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire from the Ask the Audience stuff. So okay, moving. What I'm going to look at today, if my slides work, so my trusted assistants there, is the issues of buprenorphine misuse and diversion, particularly in the secure setting, but also how that overlaps in terms of consequences in the community as well, and to have a look at some of our early experiences with Esplanade, and in fact in more detail with a service evaluation that we're in the middle of doing at the moment. So if I can just sort of cast my mind back to when we started working, 1990s, pretty much limited to methadone. As most of you will be aware, it's got high efficacy. In terms of the available data, we'd say that methadone is more effective than buprenorphine in reducing use and also maintaining people in treatment, which might be one of the reasons why we see more prescribed. But we've got some significant drawbacks in terms of the pharmacology of the medication. Slow titration period, which puts the client at increased risk of using on top while titration, which is probably the most risky period in terms of harm. High doses needing to get a blocking effect, and obviously if we look across services we see suboptimal doses of methadone being used quite routinely in terms of comparing with what the guidance would say and what the pharmacology would suggest, and also relatively high risk of harm in terms of overdose both by service user and non-service user, because it's a full opioid agonist with significant respiratory depression attached to it. So when buprenorphine started to be marketed in the UK, it almost looked like a designer drug. So if you want to treat opiate dependence, here's this amazing drug. It doesn't provide massive sedation because it's selective in terms of its action on the opioid receptor, much less risk of respiratory depression, and you've got this wonderful scope for rapid titration to a very, very effective blocking dose. In fact, I've heard evidence presented to me that with the majority of people, if you've got them on 16 milligrams, and I reiterate that that 16 milligrams is actually in their brain and not in their pocket, then if you give them a carfentanil challenge in a laboratory setting, you'll see almost no uptake by the receptors. So it's really, really effective at blocking, much more high affinity than any of the other opioids, even some of the more synthetic dangerous opioids. So incredibly effective at preventing overdose if you've got people on a therapeutic dose. So we had an increase in treatment choices. But initially, we couldn't give this away. I don't know if that's other people's experience, but, only a very low amount of my clients wanted to try it. People who were opioid painkiller dependent generally went for that medication. I think they were generally a group that were more happy with a coherent and clear mind, more interested in trying something new. Sometimes those that wanted detox, it was very useful for that. Sometimes we would look at using it where we simply were not prepared to use methadone, people who were using other large amounts of hypnosedatives like alcohol or benzos, and we just felt methadone wasn't a too risky option, so let's see what happens with bup. Generally, people were put off by the precipitation of withdrawal, this idea that you've got to be you know, the heroin's got to be flushing out before you put in the buprenorphine, or the buprenorphine will knock off the heroin for the receptors and cause the withdrawal symptom. And so it came as something as a surprise to me that working in HMP Park back in 2006, I started to see, particularly the young offenders, very chaotic polydrug users, the last person who would be, you know, in my mind, likely to be motivated to become polydrug free and take something that gave them a clear head, coming in with the story that the answer to all their problems was Subutex. And although I didn't know at the time, I just didn't buy it. It seemed like a nice idea, but no. And of course, then it dribbled in that there was intel of diversion, misuse, primarily snorting, pretty much in the secure setting. But over the next couple of years, there was an increased request for Subutex, and we work with two populations: those that access treatment of their own accord, and those that are signposted through criminal justice programs, prison leavers, people who are on probation, court orders. And it is and has remained generally the remit of the criminal justice community services, where we've seen highly medication seeking behaviour around Subutex. It's come with it manipulation, bullying, an emerging story that was coming out then of the currency that was attached to Subutex. So whereas we all expect a degree of diversion and misuse and sort of people storing and perhaps using medications that have leaked out of the system to self-medicate, this is not like that. This is an entirely different story, which is what I want to really make clear. It became one of the most commonly traded drugs across the prison system. 1 8mg making up to 160. So if let's just work that out, that's, you know, I'm not good at maths, but that's close on £500 for a weekend's takeouts doses if you can trade it correctly. The money involved comes with it a significant amount of bullying and organised crime, where within the prison system, and perhaps even moving between prisons, there will be people who are deliberately running this dealing setup, which means that if you try and sell on their patch, they're going to hurt you. So there's a significant amount of violence in prisons related to this. The high impact is on prisoner debt, which means that you've got vulnerable prisoners arriving on a wing without their canteen available, perhaps without their script following them. They're the ones that the dealers will target. Have a line of this. Initially it's free, and then, oh look, it's £10 per line. The family have to pay, the prisoner's mental health deteriorates, perhaps if family can't pay or there's issues, people are getting assaulted, people commonly store drugs in their bottoms, and they get this thing called spooning, where they actually get sexually assaulted to see if they're storing anything. Prisoners are remarkably unwilling to admit to being bullied. There's an awful lot of shame around this, so it's not something that they'll willingly open up to. Even direct questioning, it's not easy to get it out of them that they're in debt. But obviously what that means is that when the knock-on effect coming out of prison is perhaps you've got debts and you need to pay them off. So you come into a community setting and try and get yourself a buprenorphine script. The risks associated with that are quite high. We've had people faking opioid dependence, which is fairly easy to do unless you're quite suspecting of it. Taking a few cocodamols, or, you know, when you ask them to present in withdrawal, you generally don't see them again. Huge levels of intimidation towards staff, both prescribing and supervising staff if they're caught harming their medication. And we've had sort of episodes of physical violence as well. So we were really quite keen to look at solutions to this. So when we found out about Esprenor in end of 2016, and tried it and thought, yeah, this could really help. Let's try it. And so just to look at it, we think we've already explained what it is, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But the thing that attracted us to it mainly was the fact that it was rapidly dissolving in terms, it gave a level of transparency to the supervision process. It was less intimidating for the supervisor and less obstructive for the client who was taking it properly, who didn't feel that they were being judged or scrutinised in some way. It's on the tongue, it's fully visible throughout the process, and if you're taking it properly, you're gone in less than a minute. If you're not taking it properly, then it's probably not going to work for you. So we tried it. We block swapped all those on monobup to Esprenor, and we didn't dose adjust. A little bit of anxiety around this non-equivalence of bioavailability. We then rolled that out to the rest of the community services in GDAS rather selectively around available funding. What we saw was that around 50% of the clients we switched, and those that we had thought were quite stable, switched without any issue. The most we saw was mild nausea, and generally we might have had to drop the dose by 2 milligrams, and that's settled. But that hasn't continued to be an issue, and we use Espranor in doses that we would normally use buprenorphine, and we haven't found we had to use lower doses. The clients that had the high risk marker were, to say the least, dissatisfied, and we managed that with a single clinic, where we had quite a firm line in terms of not being able to negotiate, because that would have just led to endless arguments and problems. And so it was basically, this is what we're using, you could have methadone. A lot switched to methadone. Some decided that they only needed about half of what they had been taking, suggesting that perhaps they'd taken half of it and sold the other half. And then things seemed to settle down, and it hasn't been a problem since then. In terms of the service evaluation, which we did with support from Martindale, we looked at their urine testing over a 6-month period, and we're also in the process of looking at some qualitative feedback from service users, but that's not available yet. So we looked for a 6-month period, and we looked at about 97 patients in total. The take-home message from this was that around 50% dropped out after 6 weeks of those that were starting on Espranor, and the other take-home from that message was those that stuck at it, the 50% that probably wanted it for the right reasons, were let's have a look, 88% opiate free throughout the treatment, and certainly at the six week mark, which made us realise that it was useful in selecting those clients that for which this product was going to be useful, and selecting out those for which the product was not going to be useful, because let's face it, if your tablet is in your pocket and it's not protecting you or the person you're selling it to. And also for those that did take it properly, it was highly efficacious. The significant thing here was the dose, really. The average dose was 12. We're quite aggressive in terms of pushing people to go to a therapeutic dose, 16 milligrams. So I think the average was a little bit lower because perhaps some people were reducing in a planned way. So that was our conclusions from it. Generally speaking, requests for buprenorphine is have halved roughly. Those that initially request it, once they figure out it's Espranor, they'll often change their mind mid-consultation. Again, we've got people that are very stable on Espranor, and of particular note to me, I haven't had any convincing noise in the system about IV use, which was something that concerned me. We see the odd one being sold on the street and people using them when they've dropped out of treatment. Some people are trying to shove them up their nose without a huge amount of success from what I can make out, but I haven't heard any convincing noise about injecting, which is surprising, but we'll just continue to watch that space. Staff experience, overwhelming positive feedback. Myself, I would say I find it a much more therapeutic consultation around Espranor than it was around buprenorphine, and I haven't had anything thrown at me for the last 2 years, so that's progress. The managers, just a quick look at this. I think the relevant thing here, particularly if people are worried about cost of Espranor, is that if you look at our split from the first Q3, the first bar, to the final bar, what's happened is that we've increased the number of patients on methadone. We have decreased the overall number of patients receiving buprenorphine-based products. Those of them that are receiving, I'd like to think, are on it because it's right for them and it's working for them. And we don't have this dead space of people who were receiving a product that they were not taking, who were actually effectively not treated. And of course, there's been a cost saving in terms of reduction in the Espranor and the increase in methadone, which is obviously quite affordable. So yeah, continues to be a developing area. We need to be open to evolve. We don't have many tools in the toolkit, and anything that comes along is helpful. We believe that Espranor is definitely a step forward in terms of safety, efficacy, and client acceptability and staff acceptability, but we are hoping for more formal data to come out of our studies. So thank you for your time.
Great, thanks Bernadette. That's a really interesting data that you've collected there, and we're beginning to get lots of questions in, so I am sure there's going to be some quizzing of you at the end of this session. But before that happens, we've just got one more question for those of you who are watching. So we want to know if you have access to Espinor as a prescribing option in the setting you're working in. Okay, the votes are still coming in, so I'm going to wait for a few more seconds. Okay, they're still coming in. Okay, I think I'm going to close it there, and you'll be able to see actually quite a few people do have access to Espinor as a prescribing option in the settings they're working in. So I'm really pleased now to introduce our final presenter for the night. I'm going to introduce to you Anna Taylor, and she is Head of Healthcare at Her Majesty's Prison Birmingham, and she has a lot of experience in prescribing buprenorphine and prescribing Espinor as well in her setting. And I'm just wondering, Anna, I'm just going to, there you are, okay, that's good. We can see your screen now. And so I'm really pleased to introduce Anna, who is going to talk to us about her experience of prescribing Espinor in the prison setting.
Evening, everyone. This presentation is based very much on our experience of changing over to Espinor in HMP Birmingham. The questions that I'm being asked on a fairly regular basis: number one, why we did it, how we did it, and what were the steps in order to make it actually happen. I'm having a moment there. Focusing first on why we considered Espinor, we had approximately 20 to 30 patients at any one point in time on buprenorphine, and we're providing it in a crushed format. Obviously that's off license and that has its own implications, but we were starting to get some real staff concerns, particularly around ingesting it themselves. All of the issues that Bern mentioned earlier were in place in terms of diversion, in terms of bullying, and the aggravation really that was being experienced on a medication hatch about staff supervision, around how much conflict really was taking place with people denying, concealing, and every single hatch seemed to have some issue. So when we heard about Espinor, we thought, have a look at it. For those that don't know, it's the freeze-dried wafer containing buprenorphine, faster dissolution rate, making it harder to divert and faster to supervise, but with similar clinical outcomes to buprenorphine. And I note here it does contain gelatin, and I'll come back to why I've mentioned that later. So the question we asked, did we want to reduce diversion and make treatment safer? Yes. That's a nice simple question, isn't it? Did we want to save time? Yes. So I looked at how to get this into HMP Birmingham because everyone was really keen on it. But where does the money come from? What are the benefits? How are we going to justify doing this? And I ended up writing a 25-page proposal. Indeed, it covered an awful lot of areas, but we started with numbers and costs. Took a snapshot day, who was on what medication, drilling right down to which type of tablets, which type of buprenorphine, so that we could say on X day, this is how much we spent. This is how much it costs to prescribe buprenorphine. We also took an average over time, and these figures really fed into the next stage. So calculating per person per day for generic buprenorphine, and then took an NHS cost for Espinor per dose. By doing that, we were able to create the snapshot day, the cost for those doses, and how much more it would cost if we moved to Espinor from buprenorphine, average per person, average per year. However, not just about the money, and I apologise for the earworm that maybe I've given to a few people listening. Not just about the money, what is it about? It's about time. Time taken to resolve, time taken to supervise. Alongside this, you've also got to think about the implications of time, of sitting somewhere and someone really having a good look in your mouth afterwards, and the dignity and the experience that has. But back to time, we costed it out. What was the saving based on 2 NHS staff, mid-band salary? I didn't cost in the prison staff, but they are a whole other cost basis as well. Worked it out as an hour a day for 2 staff, and that's how much time we thought we might be saving, 730 hours. And if you do it on 1 band 5 and 1 band 3, because of course it's a controlled drug, so it requires 2 members of staff, we got a total of £8,149 saving per year. If it's 2 band 5s, it comes out as £9,565 saving. Then we had to think about that time. Why do we want to save time? Well, number one, I don't think that's a great use of anyone's time to be stood on a hatch for hours on end. We also had an issue with the CQC and observation of patients. So we were able to say, actually, we'll use this time for observing our patients, for spending more time with them, for building that therapeutic alliance. And of course, then we've got the safety issue. Burns mentioned it earlier, the implications of what happens when medication that's not meant for someone else gets out onto the wing and is used by others. So we had some really compelling arguments to put together. At the same time, in the same proposal, we put together all the proposals. So the protocol for commencing treatment from nil to Espinor, moving from methadone to Espinor, and moving from Bup to Espinor. What happens when someone's leaving prison? What would the protocol be there? We put together documentation with all of the SOPs, all of the information that we thought anyone would require, including officers' guides to supervising, and pictorial guides to how this could take place. We started to think about the implications that were wider than us. So who would need this other information? The local treatment agencies, none of which at the time were using Espinor. The local prisons. So who is going to receive our patients on Espinor? And they need to know information about what and how would need to be the next steps. Within the West Midlands, we had a transfer protocol, which originally was quite restrictive for where someone could go if they were on buprenorphine. Thankfully, that had changed quite dramatically, but we thought we needed to look at how to revise this to make sure that the same problems that we've had in the past with reluctance to accept someone didn't take place again. As I mentioned, the process of administration and finally the recommendation. This is the summary slide of the recommendation, that looking at buprenorphine safety, you've got diversion, Espinor, less likely. Increased safety and practicality. Look at the cost. There's a cost saving to remain on buprenorphine, but there's significant additional cost. It's offset by the time and safety considerations and the time that can be used for other things. We did also consider that there's no 0.4 milligram tablet. However, we felt that that was something we could overcome quite easily, and we needed to liaise, as I've mentioned there. So the overall recommendation was to transfer wholesale from buprenorphine to the glyphosate. We did consider, did we offer both? But rather like Bern said earlier, we thought that would add just a whole new level of complication. So the agreement was made, we transfer everybody. And we set the date, 29th of November, and we started to publicise, and we publicised widely. We went and spoke to every single individual who was already prescribed buprenorphine, and we explained what the changes were coming, what we would do, and what their individual treatment pathway would be. We then linked in with various other agencies, including the sort of local treatment, and provided that treatment guide so that everyone had the information ahead of time. And we started this around 6 weeks ahead. So I think most people were generally extremely well aware and probably quite fed up of hearing us talking about this is what's coming. Every new person that came into the prison was told this is what's going to happen. This is transferring and this is changing. We went and met the consultant from Birmingham and discussed the treatment options. We involved Prison Council and the service user groups, and they were really vocally supportive about this is something that's really going to help on the wing. I've mentioned the visits, and we involved the chaplaincy, particularly around the gelatin issue, who were very positive and supportive and perfectly willing to talk to anybody that we needed to talk to. We linked in with the health and wellbeing programme manager, and we started the training sessions. So we trained nursing staff, local drug team staff and prison staff. This is what it's going to mean. These are some of the placebos. This is what it's going to look like. So we had awareness raising sessions, and we emailed all the local drug teams, all the local prisons, and heard nothing. Silence was raging on the airwaves, which made me really, really nervous. We went and saw the individuals again and took a urine sample for everyone that was on buprenorphine, because we're now getting much closer to the date of transfer, make sure everyone is on it. And we didn't have any failures. We did have a couple of people opt to have methadone instead. Not vast numbers though, I've got to say. Emailed all the local drug teams again, emailed all the head healthcares for potential receiving prisons, and nothing. Not one concern or complaint. So we started it, we rolled it out, and we expected to hear some feedback at that point, but we didn't. There's not been a single concern, complaint anywhere raised. We have seen some attempts to conceal. HMB Birmingham is a busy local prison, for those that don't know, and our population changes roughly every 6 weeks. So a whole new cohort come in, and we regularly see attempts to conceal, following roughly that same format. We've seen cling films in mouths, we've seen dentifix, so a nice little blob of that on your tongue, which looks a little bit like it might be a wafer. Someone has regurgitated saliva and evaporated over a piece of plastic over a kettle, so boiled it down. I don't want to give anyone ideas, but that was found and was caught. And this does repeat every few weeks. We see a little spate and then it stops again. It stops because it's being found, and it stops because it's not effective to do. So our learning, it's not instant. I think there was a perception when we started this that this was an instant, it's gone in 1 second, and we had some learning to do. So we started off by putting one, like I say, on the tongue, and then letting that one completely dissolve, which for the 8 milligram does take a few seconds. Then the next one, then the next. We found that actually there wasn't any need to do that. And we spoke to the product team, put one on, start to see it dissolve, put another one on somewhere else on the tongue. So that saved time again. But it isn't that magic bullet that is instant. It does still take a bit of time, and that's okay. But it does reduce concealing, it does save time, and it does add to those security measures. My advice to anyone is use the resources that are available, e.g. the training, and we did a second batch of training and a third batch just to make sure everyone got their heads around it, prepare to retrain and revisit, learnt lessons as we went along. But in conclusion, when it's used properly, it's really positive. The supervision does still need to be in place, but it's faster. And the aggravations, the difficulties we were seeing constantly on the hatches have gone. We're not seeing that. If someone is concealing, it's really obvious and it's really easy. So we aren't getting that confrontation, and that's got to be better for that therapeutic alliance, for working together and for using that time that we're saving much more creatively. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. So we've had 3 strong presentations there, and we now have quite a few questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. The first question is coming from someone who has experience of prescribing Espinor in Liverpool, Her Majesty's Prison Liverpool, where Espinor is the only medication that's prescribed. And their experience is that there has been abuse of Espinor, including, getting some positive urine tests for buprenorphine from other prisoners who aren't actually prescribed it. And it seems to be there's discussions about people who are palming the buprenorphine or hiding it within false teeth. Wow, okay. So this person is asking if you've had no experience, any of the presenters had no experience of diversion of Esprinor.
I mean, from my perspective, as I've said in the presentation, we certainly are seeing attempts. We're catching those, I think, hopefully successfully. Difficult to know what you don't catch, but we are seeing attempts to make it, and we are seeing the challenges that are being made following from that.
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Bernadette.
So, yeah, we've seen a couple of different types of presentation around this. As I said, there are background of people who will sell their tablets, and those who drop out of treatment are occasionally, they're testing positive for buprenorphine. I'll say, what are you taking? Is it Esprinor? Is it, whose is it, basically, trying to find out where they've got it from. And occasionally it's Esprinor, I would say about 10% of the time. Generally, they've taken it to maintain themselves in treatment rather than abuse it. In terms of in the community, there's been absolutely no reports of people abusing it in terms of injecting or snorting. There's two separate categories of prisoner who will report abuse. There is a general consensus that people have had a really good go at trying to snort it without a lot of success, but that doesn't deter. There's also a few of my customers who have been probably the most put out by Esprinor, that have almost in a kind of coercive way told me very confidently that they know this is being abused, and I actually take that as intimidation, because it hasn't played out in terms of what I've seen of other clients coming back reporting the same story. It's the odd thing, almost like saying, huh, yeah, that's no good anyway, don't you know you're wrong? But they haven't been able to convince me as yet. And also in terms of the in the secure environment, well, where 100% of the medication is supervised dosing, it's just around how easy it is, if your staff are really on the ball, not to let any leak out, because it's 100% visible at all times. So if they try and get it in their tooth, well, it's going to be quite obvious they've done that, because their mouth will be open and it won't be going onto their tongue. In the community, we're going to have to live with a certain amount of leakage, because obviously people get takeout doses, and we want to encourage people who are stable to get take-home doses. And there's always the double-edged sword around that, trying to normalise and trying to give trust, but equally expecting a little leakage. I hope that helps.
Thanks. Thanks, Bernadette. We've got quite a few more questions coming in. So, when dispensing methadone and Esprinor, to prevent diversion, would you separate clients, such as see all the clients on methadone first and then see the clients who are on Esprinor?
Me, in the community, no, we don't have that control over them. No, I mean, obviously some of our clients are in pharmacies, and then obviously they'll just be attending the pharmacy whenever the pharmacist decides it's good for them. In terms of the ones that are in-house, no, they just all go in one after the other. We sometimes restrict the time on buprenorphine products simply around nurse availability. So we often say that they're an AM dispense, but they are intermingled amongst people turning up for methadone. Different in the secure, I'd imagine.
I believe in Eastwood Park we do separate the two dispensing queues, that they're delivered at separate times.
And certainly that's the experience in HMP Birmingham. We've got two separate medication hatches, so we'll separate out.
Okay, thanks. And here's another very practical question, which is, and this is a question for specifically prison settings. Do officers check patients' mouths before and after administration, or is the checking done by dispensing nurses?
Anna, I think you're probably better to answer this than me.
No problems. From our perspective, the officer does the checking. Generally, the mouth is shown to both, so the nurse and the officer, but yet the officers take a very active role within that checking process.
Okay, thanks. We've got somebody who's working in prisons in the Northwest, who's saying none of the prisons that they've worked in have prescribed buprenorphine at all. And it seems to stem from the establishment rather than the health provider. Any guidance on how we can persuade the estate to allow buprenorphine prescribing?
So I mean, this is, I sort of alluded to this in my presentation, that actually ethically that's unacceptable. You know, that can and probably will attract medical legal challenge at some point, and that may well encourage the people running the prison to change their view on that. I'm not suggesting that would be the right approach, to start suggesting people start putting in their clinical negligence claims around that, but it will happen eventually. And in fact, you know, if we look back to where the IDTS arose, you know, it was because people were successfully claiming against the government about not even having access to methadone for their opioid withdrawal when they came in. And it's, you know, it is shocking to think that people used to be treated in that way and effectively given only symptomatic medication. And okay, this is not quite as severe as that, but by default saying you cannot have that medication, and for the institution to be demanding that of the clinicians and the healthcare providers, that's unacceptable. And actually it feeds into this whole institutionalization element, which is that as healthcare providers, that needs to be challenged. We are independent. We are there to, you know, to look after our patients. And when we see issues like that arising, you know, we have to stand up and say something about that. Yeah, I think that's all I would want to say on that.
Okay, thanks, Jake. We've had a couple of questions in on the long-acting injectable buprenorphine, including, have any of you got experience of prescribing this? And I know that you don't, because we've discussed this. There is a general question: how likely is it that injectable buprenorphine will become available for use in prison settings? So I don't know, that one might be another one for you, Jake.
My own view is I think it will become available in the prison setting. And I say that because it's going to become available in the community, and therefore, you know, hopefully that will translate into benefits inside the secure environments as well. And, you know, if we look at some of the excellent aspects of Esprinol that we've covered in detail here, you know, I think the challenge that we face in accepting new preparations give us opportunities to add yet another tool to the toolbox. And I'm not saying that the injectable preparations will be the solution, but it'll be an additional tool, and certainly be very helpful. So I very much hope so. I very much hope so. I think it'll make things safer for clinicians. It would certainly make me feel more comfortable and more safe as a prescriber inside the prison setting.
Okay, thanks, Jake. We've probably got time for another couple of questions, but we're near the end of the webinar. I've got one question from a team leader who's working in prison. That they have high numbers on Esprinol. I'm taking it this is when people come into prison. They're then having to transfer to methadone. They're then released and transferred back to Esprinol. And I guess they're concerned about the stability of all this chopping and changing. So I don't know whether any of you would like to comment on that. Have you got a view on it?
I mean, on the question.
I've only got one question, which is a question, one response, which is a question back, which is why not continue the treatment that the patients come in on? Over to you, Anna.
Would you
I
like
think that would have been my response as well. That the work we did was to try and prevent that swapping and changing, and to make an easy transition. But the question would come back, you know, what is the need to transfer across?
Yes, and I'm guessing that the person perhaps doesn't have access to Espinor in their establishment. We do have another question, and this will be our final question, and it's probably to you, Anna. There's a question about what problems staff were having with crushing buprenorphine.
That was around when we had quite a high volume, staff were starting to be concerned about inhaling. And I think the agenda for PS had really highlighted to people what you might be exposed to during the sort of work environment. And that question then links in with staff saying, if I'm crushing this and I'm crushing enough of it every day, am I starting to ingest anything with the sort of dust and the particles? So that was where that one came from.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. And I think it is time for us to finish. I'm sorry that we haven't managed to ask all the questions tonight, but Jake is happy to have some fielded to him. So you will receive an email with his email address. Thanks very much to you, Jake. So I'd just like to encourage you, you're going to get a really short evaluation at the end of this webinar. I'd love it if you could fill it in because it gives us great information for future webinars. Can I thank the audience for giving such great questions and being so involved in the polls? And I'd like to thank all of our presenters for great presentations. Thanks to everybody and good night.